Is Masechet Menachot, Daf Pei Dalid, 84. And we got up to, I think your Gemara has a two dots. My Gemara that I'm using online has a two dots, so it's good. Around 10 lines from the top, we're up to a Mishnah. So the context, the background, Nava, is that the Mishnah said that every korban can be brought from Eretz, Michutz La'aretz, from old grain, from new grain, except for the Omer and the Shtei Alechem, right, which can only be brought from inside Eretz Yisrael and from the new grain. And then we quoted a Braita that argued about the old or new and said that, in fact, you can use old grain. And then we quoted a third Braita that said, in fact, you can use it even from Chutz La'aretz, right? So we had a lot of different opinions about where it has to come from. And asked Sigmar today a question from, 1 second. Oh, the wrong thing. Hold on. A question from the following Mishnah. It's a very interesting Mishnah. So the Mishnah in Masechet Shvi'it says, Tzan Hatam. We have a Mishnah. Sorry, it's not so easy. We have a Mishnah in Masechet Shvi'it, and the Mishnah says the following: Shomrei Svichim b'Shvi'it. Sorry, it's a Mishnah in Shkalim actually. Shomrei Svichim b'Shvi'it, that those who watch the grains that are growing during Shemitah, right? So remember, during Shemitah, you're not allowed to sort of take care. You're not allowed to be shomer your grain. You have to leave your field open for anyone to come and take it. The problem, of course, is that if you have to bring a carbon shtei alechem or the carbon omer on Pesach, you need grain. So how do you deal with that? How do you get grain for that? If everyone takes the grain, you have nothing left to bring for the carbon. So what do you do? So you have watchers. Tosas here says that the simplest spread, I think, is that they don't actually stop people from taking it because they're not allowed to, but they just tell people, listen, please don't take this section. We're watching it for the Beit HaMikdash. And most people are decent and kind, and they won't take it. Rashi makes it sound, and Tosfos brings other pshatim, that you in fact can stop them from taking it, because even though you're not allowed to stop people on Shemitah, for Hektish you could stop them, or for growing, or there's all kinds of other explanations. But either way, the people who are watching the Svichim, notlim scharam mitrumat halishka. That's why we quote this Mishnah in Shkalim. They get paid. Who pays them? So the general fund, the Trumat halishka, pays these watchers who are watching the grain to prevent anyone from taking it during Shemitah. So that's the Mishnah. Now, Rami Bar Chama Rav Chisda asked Rami Bar Chama to Rav Chisda, I don't understand the Mishnah. Tanan, it said in the Mishnah, we quoted a second time, Svichi Shvi'it notlim scharam mitrumat halishka v'raminu, but there's a problem. The pasuk says that food during Shemitah is la'achla. You put aside the food to eat, v'lo l'sreifa, not to burn, meaning when you take the grain from Shemitah and you bring it as a carbon mincha, you're going to burn part of it on the Mizbeach. And you're not allowed to burn food from Shemitah. You have to eat food from Shemitah, not burn it. So how can you take grain from Shemitah and put it on the Mizbeach? Amalek said back to him, well, what are you supposed to do? Torah says you should do this mincha to Omer for all your generations. So you have to do it in Shemitah years too. You want to cancel the whole thing? Amalek says to him, what do you mean? I'm insulted, says Rami Bar Chama. I didn't say to cancel the whole thing. Mika mina anati vatel. Did I say to cancel the Omer? I just don't want you to bring grain from Shemitah. Like the mit ishtaked. Bring the grain from the year before. So take grain from the 6th year, leave it over for a year, and bring it for the Omer the next year. All I'm saying is don't bring the fresh grain, because the fresh grain is from Shemitah, and you're not allowed to have grain from Shemitah be burnt on the Mizbeach. So again, obviously this has to do with our Mishnah, right? Because our Mishnah made it sound like you can't bring last year's. Then there was a Braita that said you could. So according to that Braita that said you could, why don't you just bring grain from last year and don't bring the grain from Shemitah? Said Ravina back to him, well, the answer, sorry, Rav Chisda said back to him, Be'ina Carmel. You don't necessarily need fresh grain, but it needs to be Carmel, which means it's fresh, it's young, it's Carmel, it's very early in the harvesting. Vileka, and you don't have the early grain. So said Rami Bar Chama, that doesn't bother me. Get Carmel last year, right? So meaning in the 6th year, harvest the very early grain, say this is the early grain, put it aside in the warehouse. A year later, bring it for your karban. Leiti mi Carmel de ishtakad, bring it from the early grain from last year. Answered Ravina, you can't do that. Sorry, I keep saying Ravina. Rav Chisda, you can't do that. Amar Kra Carmel Takriv. It says the word Carmel and then it says bring. Ba'ina Carmel b'shat takarava veleka. You need it to be Carmel not only when you harvest it, which would be last year. You actually need it to be Carmel even at the time that you're bringing it on the Mizbeach, and you don't have that if you take last year's grain. So that's the problem. Itmar. Now, in fact, there's a machlok in Amoraim about this exact point. We are up to halfway down, maybe. Itmar, where I don't know how to say where it's the last word on the line, probably around halfway down. So it says the Gemara, we're continuing the discussion from yesterday about the grain that you bring for the Omer. Again, our Mishnah said that it has to be the new grain. The Braita said it can be even be the old grain, and that, there was another Braita that supported that. And the question is, what's the source? Right? What is the requirement for the grain for the Karban Omer to be new grain or old grain? So Itmar, in fact, the Amoraim gave different sources for this. So Rabbi Yochanan said, the pasuk says by the Omer, Carmel Tekriv, right? The pasuk says, Lechem Mekaliv Carmel. That's what the pasuk says, Lo Tochlu. No, the next pasuk, Vayikra Bet Yudalad. Vim Takriv Minchat Bikurim Lashem, which we're going to learn in a minute, is referring to the Minchat Omer. Aviv Kaloi Ba'esh Geres Carmel Takriv. It should be Aviv, the new grain. It should be Kaloi. It should be roasted Ba'esh, and it should be Carmel Takriv, right? So it says Rabbi Yochanan, Carmel Takriv means it has to be soft grain. It has to be fresh, and so you can't bring grain from a year ago. Rabbi Lazar says the source that you have to bring fresh grain is different. It's because it says Reshit Kitzircha. It should be the first of your harvest. This is a different pasuk, of course, pasuk that we read on Yom Tef in MR. That should be the beginning of your harvest. Reshit Kitzircha, v'lo sof Kitzircha. It can't be the last grain that you harvested. Okay, so that's the machloket Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar about the source that the Omer has to come from fresh grain. Motiv Rabbah, now asked Rabbah from the following Braita. The Braita quotes now the pasuk that I just read to you. V'im hakriv minchat bikurim. Again, this pasuk is in the beginning of Vayikra, and it's not clear in the pasuk what it's talking about. All it says is v'im takriv minchat bikurim lashem. If you bring a mincha that's bikurim, that's new to Hashem, it should be aviv kaloi be'esh geres karmel takriv, right? So says the Braita, b'minchat omer katav medaber. The minchat bikurim is the minchat omer that we bring on the second day of Pesach. Now, mehechan hiba'a, what kind of grain does it come from? The Torah doesn't say. Mina seorim, it comes from barley. Says the Braita, again, this is a Braita we quoted already before, just so it's review for everyone, right? Says the Braita, Ata Omer, even you, Naba, Ata Omer mina saorim, ino menachitim. How do you know it's seorim? Maybe the pasuk's telling you to bring chitin. How do you know seorim? Says the Braita, where am I? Rabbi Eliezer the Tana says in the Braita, well, Nemer Aviv b'Mitzrayim. It says Aviv by Mitzrayim. Now, where it says Aviv by Mitzrayim is in the plague of Dever, right? Not Dever, of what's it called? The next one. I'm losing it. Anyways, in the plague of Mitzrayim, where it says that it is Dever. We should just have a Haggadah, right? Dam Sfardea, Barad is what I'm thinking of. Thank you. It says by the plague of Barad, it says Pishta v'asora nukata, that the grain was hit, ki asora aviv, because the barley was aviv. Aviv means fresh, right? In that case. So just like by Mitzrayim, it says aviv by seora, and it says aviv by the karban ledorot. Remember aviv ledorot. Ma aviv amor Mitzrayim is seorim, because it says seora aviv. Af aviv amor bedorot eno ba elamin seorim. So beautiful Pesach limud that when it says the word aviv, it means barley. So that's Rabbi Eliezer's proof. Rabbi Akiva says, well, I have a different reason to assume that when the Torah says bring a minchat bikurim, it means for the minchat omer, it means barley, because metzinu yachid shemevi chovato min achitim. Right, we find an individual brings a karban. Pretty much every karban is brought from wheat, right? Like a karban of a poor person, or a shvuat shav, or if you walk into the Beit HaMikdash, Trumat HaMikdash Ukadoshav, those are all brought from chitin. And sometimes an individual has to bring a karban from seorim, maybe chovato min seorim, which is, of course, the karban of the sota, right? That has to come with coarse grain. So there the Torah is clear that an individual brings karban mincha, sometimes from chitin, sometimes from seorim. Av tzibor, so too we should learn, says Rabbi Akiva, that when the tzibor brings a karban mincha, and remember the tzibor only brings 2 karbanot mincha. There's the minchat omer on Pesach and the shtei alechem on Shavuot. So too the tzibor that brings a karban mincha, one should be from chitin and one should be from seorim. Right? Maybe chovato min hachitin, maybe chovato min haseorim. Now we know that the shtei alechem is brought from chitin. So imato omer min hachitin, if you say that the omer is also from chitin, then lo matzino tzibor shemevi chovato min haseorim. and you'll have no public karban mincha that comes from seorim. So by process of elimination, the karban mincha to omer has to be seorim. Okay, so that's Rabbi Akiva's proof. Says Rabbi Akiva davar acher. I got another proof for you. Im ata omer ba min achitim. If you say that the omer comes from chitin, then it means that on Pesach you brought the karban omer from wheat. And then on Shavuot, you bring the shtei halechem from wheat, but then it's not the first. Ein shtei halechem bikurim. The shtei halechem is not the first fruit or first grain because you already brought that grain on Pesach. It must be that the omer is brought from barley, and it's the first barley. The shtei halechem is brought from wheat, which is the first wheat, and therefore you prove that the shtei halechem is, that the omer is barley. But the reason we're quoting this Braita, now stop, right? That's the end of the Braita. Says the Gemara, this is a proof against Rabbi Yochanan. This is how Rashi understands it. Because clearly you see from here that the reason that you bring fresh grain is from the word bikurim, right? Rabbi Yochanan earlier said in the beginning of today, that's from the word carmel, right? And Rabbi Lazar said it comes from the word reshit kitzircha. The Tosafos says this goes against everybody because it's not carmel and it's not reshit kitzircha. But Rashi seems to understand that reshit kitzircha is the same as bikurim. Reshit means the beginning, bikurim means the beginning. But the word carmel, which is about the grain, is clearly not the source for bringing fresh grain, and therefore tiyufta, it is a question, and it gets rid or uproots the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. So it is a proof against Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, continues the Mishnah now. We're quoting the Mishnah now in Bikurim. We are at the second to last line of Daf Pei Daled Amud Aleph. It's not Hatam. There's a Mishnah Mesechet Bikurim that says Ein Miviin Bikurim Chutz Mishivat Aminim. You only bring Bikurim when you bring this special blessing and basket of fruit to the Beit HaMikdash. It only comes from the Shiva Minim, not your apples and your oranges, only the 7 minim that are listed in the Torah, right? Chita, Sor, Gefen, Tena, etc. And furthermore, Lo Mitmarim, turn the page, Shebeharim, you can't bring low quality fruit. So tamarim, dates, right? They grow better in the valley. I guess they have better root systems when there's more water. So the dates that grow in the hills, in the mountains, they are not the best dates, and you cannot use those for your bikurim. And lomi perot shabam makim. Rashi understands here that perot here means with the grain, right? So not from wheat or barley that grows in the valley, because I guess wheat doesn't grow as well in the valley. It grows better on the hills or in the flat land. But in the valleys, maybe there's too much water for the wheat. I'm not sure exactly why. But either way, if it's not good quality grain or good quality tamarim, you should not bring them for your bikurim. That's the Mishnah in Masechet Bikurim. Now says Ula, which is going to form the basis of the rest of today's daf, on the second line, that not only should you not do it, but im hevi lo kidesh. If you bring them, they're not kodesh. So they don't even work, right? Even bidi avad, if you bring low quality fruit, or low quality grain as your bikurim, it's not bikurim. So that was Ula's statement on the Mishnah, which says not to do it. Now, after Ula said that, Yativ Rabbah was sitting in the Beit Midrash, and he quoted what Ula had said, right? That the Mishnah and Bikurim, that if you bring it, it's b'diavad, it's not kosher. And Eitvei Rabbi Acha bar Abba the Rabbah. Rabbi Acha bar Abba asked the following question to Rabbah from a Braita. The Braita quotes the pasuk, and again, this pasuk is in the same pasuk we just quoted, right? It says, well, it's not the same, but it's right after. It says, Karban, this is Vayikra Bet Yud Bet. I'm reading the pasuk. It says, Karban Reshit Takrivo Otam. The first Karban you should bring them, Lashem. Vel HaMizbeach Lo Yalu L'Reich Nichoach. But don't put on the Mizbeach L'Reich Nichoach. Now, we don't know what this pasuk is referring to. What is them, right? What's this Karban Reshit, right? So we, so far, have been learning that it's referring to the Shtei HaLechem, right? It's referring to the Karban Reshit that you bring on Shavuot. So it says the Braita the following, Karban Reshit, why is the Shtei HaLechem called the Karban Reshit? Shetei Reshit L'chol Menachot. It should be the first of all Menachot, meaning you don't bring any Menachot from the new grain until you bring the Karban Shtei HaLechem on Shavuot. V'cheinu over Omer, and this is based on the pasuk that says, V'akrivchem mincha chadasha l'Hashem b'Shavuot techem. You bring the new mincha to Hashem on Shavuot, right? So you see that the mincha on Shavuot, the Shtei HaLechem, is the first mincha. Okay? Now, of course, ein li ela chadasha shel chitim. Remember that the Shtei HaLechem was brought from chitin. So I only know that the mincha on Shavuot has to be the first mincha brought from grain. How about chadasha shel so'orim minayim? How do I know that it has to be the first mincha brought from barley, right? Because barley, remember, minchat sota is brought from barley. Maybe the sota can bring her mincha before shtei alechem of Shavuot. How do you know that she cannot? That the shtei alechem on Shavuot has to be the first mincha of the year for both wheat and barley. Talmud Omer chadasha. It says the word chadasha again, right? It says it once here, and it says chadasha again in Bamidbar. And so by the fact that it says chadasha twice, it may not mean the chadasha shel chitim. We don't need it to tell you that the minchat shtei alechem has to be the first one of wheat, because we already know that. Taneo inyan the chadasha shel seorim. Okay, so that is the first part of the Braita, that the minchat shtei halechem on Shavuot has to be the first karban mincha brought in the Beit HaMikdash, and not just from wheat, but even from barley. Continues the Braita, we're going to see where the question comes up. Minayin shetehei kodemet labikurim. How do you know that the karban mincha of the shtei halechem has to be before bikurim? So that before you bring the fruit to the Kohen, to the Beit HaMikdash, you have to bring the mincha. Talmud Omer, therefore it says, Chag Shavuot taselecha, do Chag Shavuot, bikurei ketzir chitim. It should be the bikurim of your harvest of your chitim, meaning that the carbon you bring on Shavuot to the Shtei HaLechem should be before the bikurim that you bring from your fruit, from your grain. So that is almost a beferish pasuk. It's not beferish, but almost beferish. Says the Braita, that maybe only is true about wheat again. Ein li ela bikurei ketzir chitim. I only know that you can't bring wheat as your bikurim before you bring the carbon shtei halechem. Kitzir sorim minayin. What about harvested barley? Maybe you could bring that as a bikurim before you bring the minchat shtei halechem. Talmud Omer, therefore, it says v'chag hakatzir bikurei ma'asecha. It repeats it basically. At the harvesting festival, which is referring in this case to Shavuot, bikurei ma'asecha asher tizra b'sadeh, that you have to basically bring first, as Rashi understands it, bring first the festival where you bring in the first mincha, which is shtei halechem, and then you could bring that which you grow in the field, which is referring to the bikurim that you bring from your plants, right? Says the Braita, well, that only tells you about what's planted in the field. Ein li ela shetizra. I only know that you have to bring the shtei halechem before bikurim from things that you consciously plant. What about alume aleim minayin? What about fruit and growth that came on its own? Right? Let's say your tree just grew. You didn't plant it. Maybe you could bring that as bikurim before the karban. Talmud Omer basadeh. Therefore, it says the word basadeh, which is extra, to tell you that even things that just grow on their own in the field also have to only be done after the shtei halechem. So the order has to be shtei halechem on Shavuot, and then you can bring bikurim. Continues the Braita, and this is our question. We're going to get to this part. Ein li ela basadeh. I only know fruit that grew in the field. How do I know about fruit? Minayin l'rabot shebigag. What if you didn't plant your plants in the field? You plant them on your roof, right? You can have a rooftop garden. Now, a rooftop, the reason we're asking the question from here is that, well, let me read the Braita, and then I'll ask the question. How about if it's grown on your roof, or shebechorba, or if it's grown in like a ruined house, or a ruined house which is not great quality land because it's covered with stones and dirt and cement and rebar or whatever they had in their houses, right? It's basically not fresh virginal land. Or atzitz, or if you grow something in a pot, where of course it does not have the freedom to grow as broadly, or you grow it in a boat, right? Basfina, which again is an artificial place to grow something. Sure, you can get dirt and grow it, but it's not as good. But how do you know that even if you grew things in those places, that you can't bring them as bikurim before the shtei halechem? Talmud Omer bikurei kol asher ba'aretzachem. Therefore, it says anything in your land, meaning even things that are grown not in a field, things that are grown in a pot, things that are grown on a boat. Now, the question obviously from here, which we're going to get to in a minute, but we're not finished with the Braita, is that these are lower quality growths, right? Obviously, you don't have the best quality grain growing in your roof or in your boat or in your bad field. And so according to Ula, you can't bring bikurim from these things, but this Braita seems to make it sound like it's not a big deal. Like you can bring bikurim even though they're lower quality. So that's going to be the question. But before we get to the question, Minayin should continue, finishes the Braita. Minayin should take kodem nisachim leperot ilan. How do you know that not only does the shtei halechem have to be brought before the bikurim, but it even has to be brought before nisachim, which are grapes, right? And before the perot ilan, for fruit from the tree, meaning not just what grows in the field, but what grows from the tree, like the geffen or teina, or I guess what else grows on trees? rimon, right? Other things like that. So nemar kam bikurei maasecha, because it says here bikurei of your actions, and nemar lalan it says later be'aspecha et maasecha min hasadeh. Ma la'alan, just like over there, it's referring to nisachim uperot ilan. Afkan nisachim uperot ilan. So this rule applies to everything. And basically, the rule of the pasuk is that the shtei alechem has to come first. You don't bring any gifts to God, meaning no mincha, not minchat chitim, not minchat saurim, no bikurim, not nisachim, not perot ilan, before you do the shtei alechem. So that's the limud from this lengthy and detailed braita. But ask the Gemara, the reason we've quoted this whole braita is that Katani Miyad, it says in the braita, where am I? I guess the sixth to last narrow line, right? Katani Miyad, it said in the braita that you would have thought that you can bring bikurim shebegag shebechorva shebatzitz shebesfina, that you can bring bikurim from things that grew on the roof and things that grew in a chorba and things that grew in a pot, things that grew in a boat before the shtei alechem. So how could you have thought that? According to Ula, things that are low quality are not even kosher bidi avad for bikurim. So how could the Braita say that? Answers the Gemara, you'd have to say, according to Ula, that actually the Braita is talking about two separate things. The first part of the Braita is talking about bikurim, but the Seifa of the Braita is not asking you, I would have thought you could bring bikurim that grew on a roof before the shtei alechem. It's saying, I would have thought you could bring grain for a mincha that grew on the roof before the shtei alechem. Maybe the only mincha you can't bring is one that grew in the field, but you can bring a mincha that grew in your hothouse, in your garden, right? So Seifa at'an Menachot, the Seifa is actually referring to Menachot that grew from grain that was lower quality, which nobody says that's a problem. It's only bikurim. Matkif Rav Ada bar Ava. Ask Rav Ada bar Ava, how in the world could you be saying that the pasuk is referring to Menachot? Ihachi, the pasuk continues. This is the pasuk in Bamidbar that we've been quoting in pasuk Parak Yud Chet. The pasuk says, and I can read the whole thing just because I have this fancy Gemara that has all the words. It says in Yud Chet Yud Gimel, Chag hakatzir bikurei ma'asecha, right? This is the pasuk we've been quoting. Asher tizra bas sadeh, and that was our question. Doesn't it just have to be the field? The end of the pasuk is, sorry, I quoted the wrong pasuk. Bikurei kol asher ba'artzechem. We're talking about bikurim of everything in your land. Asher yaviu la'Hashem, that you bring to Hashem. Lecha yiyeh, and then the end of the pasuk is kol tahar bebeitcha yochlenu. Every person who's tahar in your house, I mean, including your children and your wife and your workers, can eat this food, right? So now, if you're referring to carbon mincha, yesterday we learned from the Braita that a carbon mincha is kodesh kodashim and only izrin by zichrei kuna. So obviously the pasuk can't be referring to carbon mincha. Let me read that inside. Yachi hainu dichtiv. It says in this pasuk, kol tahar bebeitcha yochaloto. Everyone in your house can eat this. Menachot, if it's referring to a carbon mincha in this pasuk, the zichrei kuna utemetachlin. Only zichrei kuna are allowed to eat a carbon mincha. So this pasuk clearly can't be talking about a mincha. It must be talking about bikurim, which can be eaten by everybody. Says Rav Misharshia, well, slow down. There's actually two psukim, meaning two different descriptions in that pasuk. Trey Craig TV. There's two verses in the same pasuk in Bamidbar. First it says L'cha yiyeh. First it says it is yours. The chayiyeh is referring to the what's it called? The chayiyeh is referring to the mincha. You get it, meaning you and only you, the kohen. And then it says at the end of the pasuk, kol tahar bebeitcha yochaloto. Anyone in your household who's tahar can eat it. Haketzad. How do you understand the pasuk? That in fact it's referring to two different karbanot. Kan bebikurim. The second part is referring to bikurim, which can be eaten by anybody in your household as long as they're tahar. And kan b'minachot. And the first part of the pasuk is referring to the mincha, which can only be eaten by the kohen and male kohanim like him. So that is how you have to read the pasuk, which of course would be very difficult because basically you're reading two totally separate karbanot into one pasuk. Rav Ashi says, I don't think it's a problem at all. Because the truth is that the whole pasuk is referring to menachot, and that's why it's not a problem on Ula, because although it says lower quality things are brought, we're saying lower quality things are brought as a carbon mincha, which it's not ideal, but it's doable. And Ula's opinion that lower quality things can never be done as bikurim stands. How do you then explain the fact that everybody's eating the carbon mincha? Well, there are some carbonot mincha that everybody can eat. And what's that? Lachmei toda. Seifa dekra atan lachmei toda. The pasuk is referring specifically to mincha, lachmei toda. Right? Now, remember, the lachmei toda is eaten by the owner, but remember, 1 out of each 10 is given as a gift to the Kohen. And that is treated like truma, right? Just like truma can be eaten at home with anyone in the person's family and his wife and his children. So too, the lachmei toda can be eaten by anybody in the family. And so that's what the pasuk's referring to. And so that's how Ula would have to explain this Braita, which is a little bit of a dochek, but that the Braita is basically saying, you might have thought, when it's talking about which carbonot, you might have thought you can bring before the Shtei Alechem, when it talks about all of these things that come from the pot, or the roof, or the boat, or what was the fourth one, the field that was a bayit that was destroyed, those are all referring to carbon mincha. Says the Gemara, in fact, biplukta. In fact, this question of Ula, that who said that the Mishnah in Bikurim, which says don't bring Bikurim from low quality fruit, and Ula said, and if you do, it's not even a Bikurim, that in fact is a machloket amoraim. Because Rabbi Yochanan Amar im hevi lo kidesh, Rabbi Yochanan says like Ula, that even bidi avad, if you bring the carbon bikurim from lower quality food, it does not become kodesh, and it's just not bikurim. And Reish Lakish says, im hevi kadesh. Look, you're not supposed to do it. It's very clear. But if you do it, it is kodesh for bikurim, because naaseh kikachush bikachim. It's just like with kachim, where remember the kachim we're going to have soon, not so soon, but in like 6 months maybe, we're going to have Mesechet, what's it called? Bechorot, which talks about all the mumim of kachim, right? So there's a long, long list of all the different wounds and things that pasul a karban. But those are not inclusive of like a weak animal, right? Is not pasul, right? You don't have to have a strong animal. You can have a skinny, scrawny animal and bring it on the mizbeach as long as it doesn't have a mum, right? Is it ideal? Of course it's not ideal, but it's kosher. So says Reish Lakish, the same thing is true about bikurim. You can bring your scrawny little dates, and although it's not ideal, it's still kosher for bikurim. So b'diavad, it's okay. So that's Reish Lakish's opinion, and he argues with Rabbi Yochanan, who agrees with Ula. Says the Gemara now, Bishlama Reish Lakish. The Reish Lakish, he gave his reason, right? He said, where am I? Fourth? Yeah. Fourth of the wide lines on Daf Pei Daled Amud Bet. Bishlama Reish Lakish Kadamar Taima. He gave his reason that just like a carbon is supposed to be brought from the best, but if you bring it from weak ones, it's kosher. So too, bikurim should be brought from the best, but if you bring it from a weak one, it's kosher. But Ela Rabbi Yochanan my taima, what's the reason for Rabbi Yochanan who says that b'diavad it's not kosher? Amar Rabbi Elazar. Well, says Rabbi Elazar, I have an explanation. And you know how I know my explanation for Rabbi Yochanan is going to be a good one? Because Rabbi Yochanan came to me in a dream. Rabbi Yochanan chazai b'chalom. I saw Rabbi Yochanan in a dream. Now, we've had this. This is not the only time we have this. Rashi usually explains it. It doesn't mean that Rabbi Yochanan explained it. It's not like Rabbi Yochanan talked to him in the dream. But he had a dream, and he saw Rabbi Yochanan in the dream, and that's a symbol that you're going to interpret Rabbi Yochanan well, right? So like if you dream and you see something, it means that spirit or that influence is speaking to you. So milta mal yata amina. So it means I have something intelligent to say, because I have the spirit of Rabbi Yochanan with me. Right? And what is that intelligent thing to say, says Rabbi Lazar? Amar Kra, the pasuk when it talks about bikurim, right, says when you bring me reshit kol priad matcha, it doesn't say reshit priad matcha, it says from the reshit, which tells you it's not the first fruit, it's the best of the first fruit. Right? Lo kol reshit, not everything. And when it says me artzecha, it means lo kol artzecha, not everything that grows in your land, meaning not all lands are kosher for bikurim. And dates that grow on the hills or grain that grows in the valley is not kosher for bikurim. Says Gemara, that's interesting. It is a very interesting extra word in the pasuk of the mem. So Reish Lakish, what does he do with that? He says, "Hi artzecha my avidlai." What does he do with the word artzecha, which seems to tell you not everything that grows in the land can be brought as bikurim, and if it grows in a bad spot, it can't be brought. In fact, he uses it for the following Braita, because the Braita says, "Rabbi Gamliel bar Rebbe Omer," which is very interesting, because usually we don't think of anyone past Rebbe as being a Tana, right? But here we quote Rabbi Gamliel, the son of Rebbe, as a Tanya, as a Braita. Right? So Likititanya, as we have in the Braita, Rabbi Gamliel, the son of Rebbe, said, Nemer kan eretz. It says by bikurim anything that comes from the land. But nemer lahalan eretz, and it says when it's talking about Eretz Yisrael, it says these Eretz Zavat Chalav Dvash. No. Eretz Chita Usara Gefen Teinav Rimon. So Malalan Shevach Eretz, just like there, it's talking about the 7 species. Therefore, Af Kan Shevach Eretz. Here too, Bikurim only come from the Shivat Minim, and this is the source that Bikurim only come from the Shivat Minim. The Idach. Now, so how does Rabbi Yochanan learn that the Bikurim only come from the Shivat Minim? If he uses the word Eretz to tell you that grain that's grown in a bad land is not brought as Bikurim, says Rabbi Yochanan, well, it doesn't just say the word Eretz, it says Me Eretz. Idach, it says Eretz, Me Eretz, which teaches you both things. And Rish Lakish says, yeah, that's not extra. Idach Eretz Me Eretz Lo Mashmalei. I don't think you can learn 2 things out from that one word. So basically, it comes down to a very small machloket about whether when it says the word Eretz, it's just telling you that Bikurim comes from things that are the Eretz Chita Usora Gefen Teina Rimon Eretz Shemen Dvash, right? Or if Eretz is telling you 2 things, that it comes from Shivat Aminim, and it comes only Mei Eretz, only from certain parts of the land. So that is the machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about whether things that are brought from lower quality grain are kosher for Bikurim, even B'di Avad. Now, says the Gemara, 4 lines, 5 lines from the bottom, if let's go back to have this understanding, right? Because this Braita said, Tani Chada, there's one, well, actually, this Braita didn't say anything, but there's 2 conflicting Braitot. One Braita teaches that Shebegag, grain and dates and things that grew on the roof, Shebechorva, that grew in the ruin of a house, Shebeatzitz, that grew in a pot, Shebesfina, that grew on a boat, those things, Mevi v'koreh, you can bring them as Bikurim, and you could even say the words, Rami Oved Avi, the words that are very familiar to us from the Haggadah, right? You can say those things about the Bikurim. But Vatanya Idich, there's another Braita which says Mevi, you can bring those for Bikurim, but you can't read the words, because although they're kosher, B'di Avad, they're not ideal, and therefore you can't say all the good that Hashem brought me and all the things that happened. You can't tell the whole Pesach Seder on these lower quality things. So how do you reconcile the Braita? So Bishlama Rish Lakish, remember, who says that although it's lower quality things, you're allowed to bring them, and you could maybe not read, but it's at least kosher Bikurim. He would have a great explanation for these 2 Braitot. First of all, he would say, look, even if it's lower quality fruit, you're allowed to bring it for Bikurim. You can't necessarily read the psukim that talk about how great these fruit are. So how does he then explain why sometimes you can read it? So he would say, Gag lo kasha. The roof on the roof in 2 Braitot is not a problem, because ha begag dimi'ara, there could be a roof of a cave, right? If you take a house and you dig into the ground, and you're basically living underground, so your roof is essentially the ground, right? Because you're living underground. So your roof is actually a decent field, and there you can actually bring the Bikurim from that field, and you can read the words because it comes from a good growth. Ha begag debayit, where it says you can bring it, but you can't read the words. That's if it's the roof of your house, where again, on the roof of your house, you don't have layers of dirt, you don't have natural things. You can put dirt up there, you can put planters, not planters, you can put dirt and you can grow. But there you don't read the psukim because it's not such good quality. So that's the God. What about chorba lo kasha? A wreck on a wreck, one time it says you read and one time it says you don't. It depends on whether or not you've actually plowed over the field, right? Kam de chorba avuda. If a house collapsed there, but then you worked the field and you plowed it and you removed the stones, you basically returned it to its natural state. So that's a good field, and you can plant there, and you can harvest, and you can bring it as Bikurim and read the Psukim. But kam b'chorba she'eino avuda. The others, if you didn't actually, you had the stones and the concrete and everything there, and you grew in the spaces in between. So there, it's not great growth. It's like our backyard a little bit, right? It's chorba she'eino avuda. It's like a growth where it's not worked. So there you don't read the psukim. And atzitz lo kasha. What about the plot, right? If you grow in a planter, it depends. Kam nakuf, kam she'eino nakuf. It depends on whether there's a hole in the bottom, in which case it's actually just like growing it in the ground, right? Or there's no hole, in which case you're growing it artificially. And again, Rish Lakish says you can bring it for bikurim, you can't read the psukim. And svina lo kasha. The final one is a boat on a boat lo kasha, because kam de svina shel eitz, kam svina shel cheres. It depends whether your boat is made out of wood, right? Where again, what most assume this means is that your boat is shipwrecked, right? So your boat is on the land, and you're using it as like a basis to grow in. In which case, if it's made out of wood, it connects to the ground. The wood is nourished, it's organic, and it grows better. Kambasvina shalcheres, or if your boat is made out of steel, right? Then of course you're not going to grow as well inside of that boat. Or cheres is earthenware, but if it's made out of something that's not organic. So all of that makes sense according to Reish Lakish, who says that even if it's low quality, you can bring it, you just don't read the psukim. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, if you turn the page, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that you don't even bring a karban bikurim for something that's low quality, kasha. How do you explain ever that the Breita says that you bring bikurim and don't read it, right? Because if it's low quality and you can't read it, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's not bikurim. Answers Rabbi Yochanan, you're right. I have no explanation for this Breita. I think there's another Breita. Tanahi, there's a third Breita. I think it's a machloket Tanaim. The Tanya, as the other Breita says, shebegag v'shebechorva, things that grow on a roof or in a destroyed house, mevi v'korei, and presumably that's because, according to this Breita, you can actually get good quality growth from those places. But atzitz shabesfina, if it comes from a flower pot or it comes from a boat, which is a lower quality, you can't get good stuff, says this Breita, eno mevi kolikar. Forget about it's not the duality that Reish Lakish said that either it's high quality and you bring it and you read, or it's low quality and you bring it and don't read. According to this Breita, either it's high quality and you can bring bikurim and read the psukim, or it's low quality and you don't bring it at all. And says Rabbi Yochanan, I go according to this Tana. And so I don't have a problem. I mean, I have a problem, but I have another Tana who supports me. And so Rabbi Yochanan sticks with his opinion that any low quality fruit is not brought as a bikurim and not brought at all. Let's just continue to the Mishnah because it's a very fun story that has to do with the Seder. Says the Mishnah, remember the end of our Mishnah. So I don't have a Gemara, so I got to go back a few pages. But the words in the Mishnah, sorry, I'm scrolling. If you recall yesterday when we talked about where to bring the grain from, right? Sorry. Again, here we go. The Mishnah said you're only allowed to bring it from the best, right? The Mishnah on Ayin Gimel Amud Bet. And we said in the end of the Mishnah, Ezu Mufchar Shalem, what's the best place? So we said Michmas and Zonecha, those are the Alpha Lasola. And then we said Shniyim La Ofrayim Babika. That's why we're quoting this now. Ofrayim, which again, I don't know what Ofrayim is, I'm sure neither of you do, but Ofrayim must have been a very famous place where they grew grain. It was the best grain fields in the valley. Now, that's why we're quoting this following story. That's a really nice Pesach story. Says the Gemara now at the two dots. Sorry, got to get back to our place. Ayin Hey Amid Aleph. It said in the Mishnah, and you bring the grain from Aforayim. Amri Lay, now says the Gemara, there's a story, again, I don't know where the story comes from, but there's a story that Yochanan and Mamre said to Moshe. Now, Yochanan and Mamre, if you don't know them, were very famous magicians in Egypt. And when Moshe showed up and said, I'm ready to do the plagues, I got a staff, they said, Yochanan and Mamre came to Moshe and said, what are you doing here? You're bringing magic to Egypt. Tevin Adam Machnis Ephraim. It's like bringing grain to Ephraim. Right? Our Mishnah said Ephraim was where they had the best grain. What are you bringing grain to Ephraim for? We are experts at magic. What are you bringing us magic? You're going to show us your best magic? Why are you coming and challenging us with what you have? We have the best. And so you're basically wasting your time. Amarle, now Moshe said back to them, look, you're making a mistake. This is the best place to show my magic. Because Amri Inchi, as people say, Lemata Yarka, if you have vegetables, right, or your rakim as vegetables, if you have vegetables to sell, bring them to the place where they are good at vegetables, right? If you have really good vegetables, you bring them to where they appreciate that. Lemata Yarka, Yarka Shikol, you bring your best thing you bring your best watches to where they have the best watches, right? And so that's exactly my point. I think that my magic, said Moshe, is going to prove to be better than your magic, and I think he was right ultimately. And therefore, I'm coming here to show you how good stuff I got. So you guys are dismissing me and saying, why are you coming and starting up with this? We're so good at this. In fact, I'm coming exactly here to show you how good it is. And the reason we quote this, of course, besides that it's Pesach, is that we quote this statement of Tevin Atam Machnis Ephraim, which the modern statement of that, it's like bringing coal to Newcastle, right? That's the statement. Now, but look it up. It's like Teven Lo So Moshe actually won in the end, and that's why we got Pesach. Okay, Shakoch, everyone. Miriam, I'm away 2 days, but I'll be back next Shabbat, God willing.
So you're gonna do next Saturday night?
Yeah, next time, regular.
Okay. Shavua Tov.
So have a great Chag. Bye.
You too. Bye.